Chapter 6. So did I do well explaining things to Elise? Augie asked as he worked his combination lock. Really well. You really understand this stuff. You're going to ace the test. I guess. We'll see. Let's hurry. I grabbed my books, the ones I'd need for science, history, and then math, which we had just before lunch. I slammed the door closed, clicked the lock, and then took 2 steps down the hall. I stopped, went back, and checked to make sure it was locked. Hurry up, Augie called from down the hall. I hurried after him, going fast but not running. Running in the halls meant detentions. I felt like a fish swimming upstream as I fought my way through the crowd, trying to catch up to Augie and get to class. There were always so many kids in the hall because there were so many kids in the school. It was a huge school with more than 600 students. The strange thing, though, was that it seemed like Augie knew almost all of them, at least everybody in grade 8, by name, and the few that he didn't know all seemed to know him. Well, just make it, Augie said as we turned off the main corridor, which held all the lockers, and into a stairwell. We took the steps 2 at a time and opened the door at the top leading to the 2nd floor. Up ahead, I could see our whole class standing in front of Mr. Johnston's class. Why weren't they inside already? Augie walked up to Elise, who was standing with some of her friends. Why is everybody waiting out here, he asked. The door's locked. That's strange, I said. Mr. Johnston's always here early to take care of the animals, and I don't ever remember him being away. Mr. Johnston's away? Augie asked. I didn't say that. If he is away, does that mean we won't have a test? Augie asked hopefully. That only means we won't have a test today, I said. But we will have a test tomorrow or the next day or whenever. You mean I'll have to remember this stuff for a few more days? That's not possible, he said, shaking his head emphatically. My head will explode or at least start leaking out bits of information, like in osmosis. I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes his head did seem like a semi-permeable membrane. So he was right. It could start dripping out. We need that test today, Augie said, raising his voice. He pushed through the crowd toward the classroom door. I followed in his wake. What are you going to do? I asked. Pound on the door. Somebody's got to be in there, like a supply teacher or somebody. I want my test. I demand my test, Augie said loudly. He raised his hand to knock on the door, then stopped. We both saw it at the same instant. The little glass window in the door was shattered. A piece of plywood had been nailed into place behind the few jagged pieces of glass that remained in the frame. Augie turned to me. His expression reflected my own confusion. Just as I opened my mouth to say something, the PA came to life. Please stand for the playing of O Canada, called out the voice of our principal, Mr. McDonald. There was still some mumbling and shuffling before kids quieted down. Please sing along, Augie said in a loud voice, doing a perfect imitation of our principal. And remember, the first line of the song is, O Canada, our home and naked land. Everybody broke up laughing. Very amusing, called out a deep voice. It was Mr. Scully, our vice principal. He had just stepped out of Mr. Johnston's room and was holding the door partially open. I wonder if our principal would be as impressed by your imitation as your classmates are. The first few notes of O Canada started to play, and everybody froze in place. I kept my arms tightly against my side and sang along. The last notes of the song faded away. Augie, get in here now, Mr. Scully said, holding the door slightly more open. Poor Augie, he was going to get into trouble, and Ricky, you come along as well, Mr. Scully added. Me? I asked in shock. I didn't know what was more unexpected, that he wanted me to come too, or that he even knew my name. I did know which thought scared me more, but I wasn't doing anything, I pleaded. He scowled and hooked a finger at me. Numbly, I stumbled forward while the rest of the class stood. Listening to the morning announcements, I squeezed through the opening of the door, careful not to make contact with Mr. Scully. Why was he making me come? I hadn't done anything wrong, and, my God, what happened? I asked. It looked like a tornado had passed through the room. There were books and papers strewn everywhere. Some of the plants had been knocked over and dirt was all over the floor, and what about the animals? One of the big aquariums was smashed, and a couple of the cages were lying on the sides on the floor. And wait, the entire front of Bogart's home, the sliding glass door, was shattered, lying in a million little pieces on the floor. Somebody, or more likely many people, broke into the school last night, Mr. Scully said. And they did this? I asked in disbelief, my voice barely louder than a whisper. This and a whole lot of other things. They bashed a couple of the drinking fountains right off the walls, stole some AV equipment, and did this to a number of the classrooms. That's awful, Augie said. Yes, it is, Mr. Scully agreed, but you two can help. Do you want us to clean up? I volunteered. Thank you for the offer, but that won't be necessary. The caretaking staff will be in shortly to start that job. But what can we do then? I asked. As you can see, some of the cages have been disturbed, and some of the animals have gotten out. Mice and rats and gerbils, frogs, and I think some of the turtles, and... What about Bogart? I asked. I didn't see him. He's not here, Mr. Scully said. He's with Mr. Johnston. So he's okay, I asked. Mr. Scully didn't answer, but he looked uneasy. Is Bogart all right? I repeated. Mr. Johnston is looking after him. I'm sure he'll be fine. Why don't you boys stay here and work? Mr. Scully said. I can't leave the rest of the class in the hall unsupervised, and I can't bring them in here. I'll find some place for them to go. He walked to the door and then stopped and turned around. And boys, please be careful. I don't want you to get cut or injured with all the broken glass and overturned equipment. He opened the door to leave, and the noise from our class milling around in the hall outside the door flooded in. Everybody settle down, Mr. Scully yelled. The noise dropped off and then was sealed away when the door closed behind him. Augie and I were alone in the room. The only noise was the squeaking of an exercise wheel in one of the cages. The cage was lying on the floor, upside down, with the little metal door on the side open. Augie walked over, picked up the cage, and set it down on the counter, making sure the door was properly shut. At least this guy's okay, he said, although his water bottle got smashed. Are there any replacement bottles around here? Yeah, maybe. I wasn't sure. Everything was just broken up. Ricky! Yeah? Are you okay? I shook my head. I just don't know. Where do we even begin? With this hamster, Augie said. You can't look at the whole room, just focus on one little piece at a time. And that piece is this hamster, and he needs a drink. Understand? I nodded my head. Are there any other water bottles to replace this broken one? He asked again. I nodded again. Good. And do you know where they are? For the third time I nodded. Then get one. Sure, okay, I mumbled, stumbling toward the back of the class where they were kept. I stepped on broken glass which crunched under my foot and around the other debris strewn on the floor. I opened the cupboard. It was filled with bottles and beakers and test tubes. It was undisturbed. Maybe the only place in the whole room that was. I reached in, grabbed a water bottle, and filled it from the tap. I walked back, stepping around as much garbage as possible, and clipped it onto the cage. The hamster, smelling the water, rushed over and started drinking thirstily. Do you know how many animals and what kind of animals were in each cage? Augie asked. More or less. That's what I thought. Take these. He handed me a pad of paper and a pen. I'm going to put the cages back onto the counters and shelves. You're going to follow behind me and rip off one piece of paper per cage. On that piece of paper, you're going to list how many animals and what type of animal is supposed to be there. Then put that piece of paper on the top of the cage. Understand? Yeah. Then you'll search the cage. You'll look in the shavings or whatever is inside the cage because maybe more than just one hamster stayed in the cage. Does that all make sense? Perfect sense. That's a great plan. Don't sound so surprised. I wasn't. Not at all. You always have good plans, I admitted. It's just that I never understand. I let the sentence trail off. This wasn't the time to be asking questions. Never understand what? Augie asked. Nothing. Had to be something, Augie insisted as he turned to face me. I swallowed hard. Well, what? It's just that you're always thinking these things through, planning smart plans, really smart plans, and you understand people so well, but why don't I do better in school, right? I nodded. I wish I knew, Augie said with a sigh. I wish I knew. He paused. He turned away and picked up another cage, placing it on the counter. I made a note and put it on the first cage. There was one hamster still inside, 5 missing. There's no point in recapturing them if we can't keep them in the cages, Augie said. He picked up a cage that was bent out of shape as if someone had stepped on it. He used his considerable strength to reshape it into something that would hold the rats that made it their home. I caught sight of movement in the cage, opened the little door on the top, and reached in. There, nestled amongst the shavings, was a mother rat with 5 little pink naked bodies nuzzled up to her belly, nursing. Wow, I've never seen rats that little before, Augie said, peering in over my shoulder. They can't be more than a few hours old, I commented. Unbelievable. Despite all of this, I couldn't help but smile. The bell rang to signal the end of first period. Augie and I had done a lot in less than 40 minutes. The cages were all back in place, and surprisingly, large number of animals had stayed in their cages, despite open doors and bent frames. We'd also already recaptured a number of the animals that had escaped and had put them back in their pens. Some others had been found, but they were dead. There was nothing we could do about it. On the floor, right beneath the 3 smashed aquariums, were dozens and dozens of dried-out carcasses of fish that had been so alive just yesterday. No longer brilliant red or blue or green or orange, they were now gray and brown and black. It was sad, but somehow right that death had robbed the tropical fish of their vivid colors. I'd grabbed a broom and just swept them up. I wanted to get them out of sight before Mr. Johnston got back. He loved those fish. He loved all his animals so much. Then I saw something that made my stomach flip. On the floor in the corner, spread out with its legs and head extended, was one of the turtles. It was squashed flat like a bug. How could this have... I couldn't stop myself from picturing the little turtle crawling away after its world was overturned and destroyed, slowly moving off along the floor trying to get away, when a big ugly foot smashed down on it. I shuddered. How could anybody do such a thing? But maybe it hadn't been done on purpose. Maybe it had been done by someone like me, walking across the room, tripping on things. Maybe it had been an accident. And then I saw a second splattering and a third and a fourth. Flattened turtles. This was no accident. Somebody had deliberately stomped on each one. I felt my tongue grow thick and my chin start to quiver. I tried to sniff back the tears. I didn't want Augie to see me crying over a bunch of turtles. What would he think? I heard the door open and turned around to look. It was Mr. Johnston. He looked awful, as sad and upset as I felt. I wished he hadn't come for a little while longer. We needed more time to clean up this mess. We've got a lot of them, I said, trying somehow to offer him a glimmer of hope. He nodded. Thank you both, he said, his voice cracking over the last few words. I knew I could count on you two. We'll keep working here, I said. We'll take care of everything. How's Bogart doing? Mr. Johnston looked away. That was stupid. I shouldn't have asked. I shouldn't have said anything. Mr. Johnston opened his mouth like he was going to say something and then stopped himself. He sighed loudly and his whole body seemed to shudder. Bogart is dead. And that's where we end that chapter.